in September 1845 upon a criticism of the young Hegelians, which was to become their important work entitled The German Ideology. What is significant about the book, The German Ideology of 1846, is the intellectual break between it and the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844. Here in the German Ideology, so soon after the 1844 manuscripts, there appears the first formulation of the so-called mature Marxism, in which the theory of self-alienated man, which had been the central theme of the 1844 manuscripts, is now shrugged off as a conception of the philosophers, and presumably as having no value. Missing from the German ideology are the idea of the self, the objectification of the human essence in objects produced, the working man's alienation from himself, world history as a loss of self, and ultimate self-regain. In place of the self and the humanistic concern of the 1844 manuscripts with self-realization, mature Marxism in the German ideology speaks about societies, labor versus capital, proletariat versus bourgeoisie. It speaks about relations and forces of production. It speaks about an economic base and an ideological superstructure. These are all words from the familiar language of mature, conventional Marxism. They appear to represent the impersonal scientific vocabulary of the social sciences. Why did Marx make this fundamental shift from the humanistic focus upon the self to the impersonal scientific focus upon economic relationships? Are there two Marxisms, that of the 1844 manuscripts and that of the later scientific socialism of the German ideology, or can they be reconciled? First, in answer to the question, why this switch, several suggestions can be offered as to why Marx made the dramatic switch from understanding human life in terms of the alienation or conflict within the self to understanding it in terms of external, economic, class conflict. The taking of this step may have represented to Marx gaining the objectivity and the great prestige of social science for his theory. A second suggestion is the role of Engels. Engels had an impressive knowledge of the economics of industrial capitalism, and Engels had made the claim that once an economic system is operative, it is beyond human control. These may have influenced Marx toward economic explanation rather than philosophical explanation. And a third answer, the futility of the idealistic, philosophical, humanistic, young Hegelian movement, and the failure of this philosophic movement either to interpret or to change the world may have led Marx to turn to a scientific perspective instead. Two other explanations are psychological in nature. First, the growing personal maturity of Marx may have permitted him now to identify with his father's Enlightenment ideals of science and scientific objectivity, and to obey at last his father's constant urging him that Karl, give up your fanciful young Hegelian speculations and become more prosaic, come down to earth. And a final explanation. In Marx's reference to, in the German ideology, to settling accounts with Hegelian philosophy, Marx appears to be switching to economics in order to establish, at last, his own separation and independence from the domination over himself of Hegelian philosophy, specifically of Hegel's humanistic account of finite spirit in the phenomenology of spirit. These are possible explanations of Marx's shift. There remains the need to answer the second question. Are there then two Marxisms, that of the young and of the mature Marx? And if so, can they be reconciled? What we have found is that the scenario of world history presented by the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844 is that of economic man's alienation from the products he has himself created, and that of regaining himself through a world revolution. This scenario is revised in the writings of the mature Marx. Beginning with the German ideology, there is a new scenario of world history as class struggle and its overcoming by the revolution of the proletarian class and the ultimate advent of a class-less society. The scientific scenario, for the most part, eliminates the idea of the self, alienation, the drama of the loss of self and self-regain. And the new scientific scenario uses instead the impersonal concepts of labor, capital, economic production. Nevertheless, the scientific scenario of world history will continue to be expressive of the themes of alienation, conflict, revolution that produces human deliverance and salvation. Marx will use the impersonal concepts of the scientific scenario in such a way that the themes of the alienated man scenario will still be expressed. There are not two Marxisms then, but only one, which evolves from the conflict within alienated man to the conflict of economic classes. And the secretiveness of Marx, Engels, and Soviet officialdom with regard to the 1844 manuscripts is clearly the result of their embarrassment concerning revealing the philosophical, non-scientific, humanistic, and subjective roots of Marxism. We turn next time to the powerful works of the mature Marx.